When a crisis hits, our institutional response is almost entirely economic. Whether it's a natural disaster or a sudden loss of income, federal and state agencies immediately deploy grants, loans, and financial safety nets designed to make citizens whole. We see this recovery framework in the physical footprint of disaster relief, where FEMA and the SBA treat crises as deficits requiring a deposit. This economic logic is automatically applied to fraud victimization. If a scammer drains a victim's account, the presumed solution is a bank reversal, an insurance claim, or a criminal restitution order. For decades, we have positioned bank tellers and financial investigators as the primary mediators of fraud recovery, treating the incident as a transactional error. But this institutional architecture relies on a critical logical flaw. It operates on the assumption that the only thing breached and stolen during a fraudulent interaction was capital. A 2026 systematic review published in Frontiers in Psychology challenges that premise. The researchers set out to measure the long-term post-victimization realities across global populations. This flowchart shows the PRISMA screening methodology used in the study, detailing how researchers filtered over 5,000 database records down to the most empirically sound clinical data. Ultimately, they identified 21 distinct studies analyzing the specific outcomes of fraud victims. The data revealed that fraud creates a secondary, invisible ledger of psychosocial distress, a psychological burden that frequently persists long after the financial losses are resolved. This distress correlates heavily with the degree of emotional manipulation the victim endured, completely independent of how much money was actually taken. The researchers conclude that fraud behaves less like a theft of capital and more like a form of betrayal-based interpersonal trauma. To understand how this trauma occurs, we have to look at the mechanics of the attack. How do modern threat actors consistently bypass robust digital security frameworks like multi-factor authentication? Modern scams exploit a core feature of human cognition, known as dual process theory, the constant conflict between slow, deliberate logic and fast, intuitive emotion. This model shows a digital attack on the left and a human brain on the right, shifting from deliberative logic into affect-driven emotion. As the scammer accelerates the attack with extreme urgency, cognitive load saturates. The brain's warning system flashes red, completely overriding logical evaluation. Tactics like AI deepfakes or cloned federal websites are engineered specifically to trigger this physiological response. The bad actor's true hack is creating a highly immersive, emotionally salient environment that forces compliance. Throughout the interaction, the victim's baseline state of trust or fear is artificially manipulated to an absolute peak. Then, the deception is uncovered. The victim experiences a sudden, violent cognitive crash into deliberative logic. As logic catches up to the actions taken under emotional manipulation, profound psychological dissonance sets in. This cognitive hijacking is the primary injury. Financial loss is merely the byproduct of psychological assault. That initial moment of realization is just the beginning of a chronic clinical timeline. When we look back at those 21 empirical studies, we can map exactly what happens to the victim's mind in the aftermath of the attack. This map highlights regions analyzed in the systematic review: North America, Europe, Asia, and Oceania. Across these populations, researchers documented severe psychiatric outcomes, including major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and elevated suicide risk. Whether a victim endured a prolonged online romance scam, localized identity theft, or an institutional financial exploit, the resulting psychiatric outcomes were nearly identical. In fact, psychological harm inflicted by fraud is routinely comparable to trauma experienced by victims of violent physical crime. But the most insidious, long-lasting symptom identified in research is something else entirely, spreading across the map to infect every data point. It is the erosion of interpersonal trust. Victims lose their baseline assumption of safety, viewing future social and digital environments with severe suspicion. In clinical terms, this is a betrayal trauma. The violation of a person's autonomy and trust is the central determinant of the injury. Because the attack vector targets human trust, the resulting injury is a psychological trauma. Treating it as a mere financial deficit misdiagnoses the patient entirely. If clinical symptoms are this severe, why do they remain largely invisible to our healthcare system? This silence is enforced by self-conscious emotions, specifically the paralyzing weight of shame and guilt. This diagram shows the feedback loop preventing intervention, moving from cognitive dissonance to internalized blame to anticipated stigma to concealment. At internalized blame, victims view deception as a personal failure. This fuels anticipated stigma. Fear of judgment creates an impenetrable barrier, driving total concealment. This concealment prevents victims from accessing essential social validation or professional mental health support. Social stigma acts as a secondary trap engineered into the fraud, locking the victim in isolation and ensuring the psychological damage becomes a chronic condition. This brings us back to the financial first response framework that currently dominates our institutions. When victims do come forward, they are met with a strictly procedural approach. They encounter complex paperwork, bureaucratic friction, and often dismissive responses from authorities, all of which actively exacerbate their distress. This chart illustrates the ultimate failure of this approach by mapping financial recovery against human recovery. Even when a bank restitution or grant succeeds in dropping the financial loss to zero, the psychological distress remains perpetually elevated, creating a massive restitution gap. Our public architecture is aggressively treating the symptom, missing capital, while entirely ignoring the underlying disease. The data from the Frontier study requires us to move past the financial default. Institutions must officially and immediately reframe fraud victimization as a public mental health concern. An integrated response architecture has to move beyond automated bank claims and law enforcement task forces. We need trauma-informed and stigma-sensitive care embedded directly into the very first touchpoints of fraud response systems. That means implementing routine mental health screening and clinical psychoeducation for all fraud victims at the moment they report the crime. We must adapt to the reality of the threat. The cognitive and emotional breach requires the exact same urgency, validity, and resources as the financial one.